Remember the old adage, an honest day's pay for an honest day's work? Do you feel you're working more for less? You're listening to ReachMD XM 157, the channel for medical professionals. Welcome to the Clinicians Roundtable. I'm Dr. Bill Rutenberg, your host, and with me today is Dr. William Rich. Dr. Rich is the chair of the AMA Relative Value Scale Update Committee, or RUC. He is a board-certified ophthalmologist practicing in Northern Virginia. Dr. Rich is the Secretary for Federal Affairs and Medical Director for Health Policy of the American Academy of Ophthalmology. He has served as a consultant to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and he was on their panel dealing with the future of fee-for-service medicine. Today we're discussing how a doctor gets paid. Hi, Dr. Rich. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today at the Clinicians Roundtable.
My pleasure.
A urologist friend of mine said to me recently, Bill, I had a great day. I collected $100 in copays. Now, he's not the only doctor I know expressing frustration about the compensation system, and not the only one who has stopped paying AMA dues because of that frustration. How would you respond to them?
Well, I think the entire medical profession is under pressure, especially those physicians who are dependent upon public sources of reimbursement. That would include Medicare and Medicaid. Certainly, Medicare payments, which are paid under Part B and financed through current tax revenues, under tremendous pressure now because we have to compete with the war, infrastructure costs, education needs, interstate highway system, bridge repairs, and every year we have to compete with these other interests. In addition, you have some real philosophical differences between Republicans and Democrats on how much money should be allocated to Medicare.
Speaking about the allocations, today, Wall Street Journal, bill on Medicare payments to doctors stalls in Senate. A bill aimed at preventing a 10.6% cut in the Medicare fees paid to doctors fell short of the votes needed to move forward. Is the sustainable growth rate basically a broken system?
It is. Prior to 1992, physicians were paid on usual customary charges. In other words, what was the typical charge in the community or your specific charge, whichever was lower is how you got paid. That was pretty sweet. From 92 on, we've been paid on the basis of the relative value scale. And one component of that was to curb expanding costs. So in 1997, some amendments were made to the sustainable growth rate, which is basically a budgeting mechanism that CMS uses. And it's grievously flawed. It makes the assumption that the rate of growth of physician services should not exceed the GDP. Now, what does the GDP have to do with an aging population, exploding technology, and new indications for treatment of disease?
Does it have anything to do with it?
No, it doesn't, but that's what we're saddled with. In addition to that, physician growth, as a result, always exceeds the GDP. And the areas of growth, some of them are things that docs have absolutely no control over, Bill. For instance, drugs given in the office, the pricing of which comes out of a black box from industry, has increased 300% over 5 years. So all the cancer drugs, new treatments for inflammatory bowel disease and retinal disease count against our budget. In high-end imaging, PET scans, MRIs, CTs are growing about 18% per beneficiary per year. So with that exploding growth, it drives down other services that are actually growing modestly that would normally have increases. For instance, evaluation of medical EM services grow about the rate of the GDP, and surgical services grow less than 1%. So it's these exploding areas of growth that are really hammering down physician fees. You know, it's not just a 10% cut now, but you're looking at cumulative 38% cuts by 2012. So obviously, the whole concept of the sustainable growth rate is broken.
I picked up that you said the sustainable growth rate is to physician fees. Are hospitals not at all bound by this?
No. Hospitals get their little market-based updates every year. It would be nice if we could. Basically, we do have a little adjustment. We have something called the Medical Economic Index, but that's balanced. Suppose that's 3%. Well, if the growth in services exceeds the SGR, you wipe it out. So that's why we're looking at accumulated deficits.
The relative value-based scale, RBRVS, is the brainchild of a Harvard economist that was first published in 1988. The man was an actuary for Connecticut General Life Insurance Company, which is the predecessor of Cigna. and then he was an actuary to the Social Security Administration. How did we in organized medicine, and maybe this is before our time, but how did we in organized medicine allow what was, as I understand, developed to be a research tool to become a payment system? And how do we continue to tolerate it?
Well, you have to go back to do a little history, Bill. When Medicare was passed, the government decided in order to implement this, we had to use mechanisms that docs were used to. So that's why we use intermediaries like Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Aetna. And also they wanted to utilize a payment mechanism that docs were used to, usual customary charges. So from 1964 to the late 80s, physician fees were actually paid pretty nicely. About that time, Congress and society said, it doesn't make a lot of sense to base payment on what docs think the charge should be. It should be based on the resources needed to provide that service. So there were basically three reasons why RBRVS was adopted. One was pay for physician services based on the resources needed to provide them. Physician work, your practice expenses, and your liability costs. The second goal was to change the manpower decisions of young docs in medical school. Even then, we were having problems with manpower in primary care. So the intent was to shift the valuation of services from procedures to cognitive services. And the third function was to slow the rate of growth of services. So that was the reason why RBRVS and Dr. Shao's research project was adopted, passed by Congress in 1989 as amendments to the Social Security Act for Medicare, and implemented in 1992. Now, RBRVS is how we get paid by about 95% of commercial payers, and most state Medicare plans have adopted RBRVS.
I'd like to welcome those who have just joined us at the Clinicians Roundtable on ReachMD XM 157. I'm Dr. Bill Rutenberg, and with me today is Dr. William Rich, chair of the AMA Relative Value Update Committee, or RUC. So, based on that, is that how the RUC came into being?
It was. The RUC is an advisory body to CMS. CMS basically has the final say in all valuation of services. And the RUC has 29 people that sit around a table as judges. 26 of them vote. There's a wide representation of medical and surgical subspecialists. And they really vote on the inputs for the practice expenses, the cost of the equipment, your clinical labor, which is the biggest overhead that we all have, and the work valuation of the services. CMS devises the practice expense inputs. And the RUC meets 3 times a year. They're brutal meetings, 3-4 days long, 12 hours a day. And basically, many of the goals of RBRVS have been attained. There's been a huge shift in valuation of services from major surgical procedures to cognitive services. Every major procedure under RBRVS has been decreased in real dollars from 1993 to 2007 by 42%. The valuation of EM services is up about 82%. So that goal of RBRVS has been attained. Unfortunately, it hasn't influenced physician income disparity or manpower, but the valuation of that goal of RBRVS was met.
I've seen that as a criticism of the RUC. There's several articles that recently appeared, but that the RUC, even though there are 29 members, that Medicare billings goes about 50% to primary care specialists who only hold 3 seats out of the 29. Does that seem fair to you?
Well, I think you have to look at the product. If you look at the ability of the RUC to evaluate evaluation and management services, it's not just primary care that supplies those services, Bill. Currently, there are about 8 surgical subspecialties that have over 50% of their income from EM. And many typical medical subspecialties are way beyond 50% of their revenue from EM. For instance, cardiology, GI, dermatology, oncology, nephrology all have less than 50% of the revenue from evaluation and management services. General surgery, hand surgery, OBGYN, ophthalmology, ENT, plastics, and urology all have more than 50%. So obviously, even though there's a disparity in the representation of primary care, the valuation of primary care services have been dramatically increased, and the docs sitting around that room can evaluation EM services because many of them provide it and have a vested interest in seeing that they're treated fairly.
Are the RUC meetings open to the membership of the AMA?
Yes, they are. What they're closed to is industry. Wall Street would love to sit in on a RUC meeting. The analysts that advise Wall Street would love to be in there, but it's closed to that. But a physician whose specialty is represented in the House of Delegates is welcome to sit in. We have about 100 guests sitting around that table, or maybe about 200 observers, analysts from the different specialties, and guests. So critics, curious people, people that are interested in analysis, financing, they're welcome to sit and observe.
Over your tenure as chair of the RUC and even on the committee, have you seen any egregious examples of things that have been both overvalued and undervalued? I mean, is there anything that just sort of, you looked at this and said, this really gets my goat. We got to do something about it?
Happens every meeting. The irony is, I think that people, Bill, that have not sat in the room don't realize the debate that goes on. I will guarantee you that if you sat in that room and listened to the debate and I flipped over a little identifier that sits in front of every chair, you could not tell who was a surgeon, who was a primary care doctor or medical specialty. If a surgical subspecialty walks in with an overvalued code, who's going to really realize that the nature of that service and the proposed values? It's going to be other surgeons. It's going to be anesthesiologists that watch them perform. So paradoxically, most of the critique will come from other surgical subspecialties, and a lot of the critique of a medical subspecialty code, be it GI or cardiology, is going to come from the family docs and the general internists that refer to them. So you do get vigorous debate. Probably, this is off the top of my head, but of new codes that are brought in with valuation by a specialty, less than half of them pass the two-thirds vote necessary for approval. And they're turned down, and they're sent to a facilitation committee where there's a broad representation of primary care and surgical specialties that will look at the suggested values for the RUC and come back with a new proposed value. But every meeting, you see values that are turned down.
I'd like to thank Dr. William Rich, who's been my guest, and we've been discussing the RBRVS and the Relative Value Scale Update Committee of the AMA. I'm Dr. Bill Rutenberg. You've been listening to the Clinicians Roundtable on ReachMD XM 157, the channel for medical professionals. To listen to our on-demand library, visit us at reachmd.com. Register with promo code RADIO and receive 6 months of free streaming audio for your home or office. If you have comments or suggestions, call us at 888-MD XM 157. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I wish you good day and good health.